Sandra. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you. And I will say that it's a great privilege for me to be the first Director of Conservation Horticulture at the San Diego Botanic Garden. So we have long been in the world of working with rare plants, but we're changing the style and the arrangement and the focus of how we do that stuff. So I will be pointing out, calling out essentially a couple of other people on my team who, if not for their help throughout the last several years, I couldn't have done any of this. So I'll try to embarrass them a little bit as they come up in photos. To start out, this is me with one of my favorite local plants, the Baccharis vanessae, or Encinitas baccharis. And let me give you a little bit of background for those of you who maybe are less familiar with the San Diego Botanic Garden. We're in Encinitas, and we have been a public garden for 50 years now. And throughout that time, there were already rare native plants growing on site, such as the one that you see in the upper left. That's Arctostapylos glandulosa crassifolia, also known as Del Mar manzanita. It's one of my favorites, and actually kind of the species that got me engaged with native plant conservation. Next to that is Rosa minutifolia, which is a beautiful species that really has had a hard time in the wild. So not only do we have a clone from Otay Mesa of that wonderful species, but in the early 90s, some of the staff from the botanical garden, before it was even a nonprofit, did an expedition down to Baja to bring in more wild collected seed of that species. One of the species that I talked a lot about at that conservation conference presentation is Hazardia orcuttii, which is one of my favorites because it's a weirdo and it has such a tiny natural range. And at a certain point in time, there were only a couple hundred individuals left. And the fact that we're able to grow it is a big part of why there are more of them. And that's one of my favorite things about this kind of work. I couldn't neglect Berberis navinii and not regret it. For whatever reason, this is one of the most underappreciated species in local landscapes, as far as I can tell, and it barely has a natural existence in Southern California, but it grows wonderfully everywhere. And it's actually been in cultivation for 100 years at this point, going way back to Theodore Payne. So I wanted to kind of highlight that because it performs so wonderfully for us that you should be growing it too. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I want you to take a look at this. This is a sort of a mapping of how we work with plants in terms of conservation. There's both conservation of plants in their natural spaces and preservation and sort of backup repositories of plants outside of those natural spaces, such as the physical garden itself in Encinitas. There's also different modes of doing that, like seed banking, tissue culture, cryopreservation, all that fun stuff that the zoo kind of culture has been using for a long time. And we're starting to catch up with plants. So you'll hear me talk about zoo stuff again, but this is not my slide, but I will love it because those bottom three categories, the research, horticulture, and education, really strongly align with what we're doing at the Botanical Garden and doing more of as we go forward. So I'm actually the Director of Conservation Horticulture within a brand new Science and Conservation Horticulture, or excuse me, Science and Conservation Department, only as of October of last year. And so this is all very new and very exciting, and we're building out the team as I speak. So the fact that we've had so much support so far has been really heartening. And even during a downtime, during a global pandemic, we've been able to really rapidly expand these programs. So one way to think about this is holistic plant conservation. So we're working with plants everywhere that they exist and in partnership with as many different entities as we can engage to do all of the above. Protect them in their natural spaces like preserves and so on. Also bring them out, learn how to work with them, learn how to cultivate them, make sure that no matter what, they don't disappear, even if that sadly only means that they exist in a garden. One of the most effective ways that we can actually do this work is seed banking. So if species are suitable to be seed banked, which is not all of them, and I'll talk later on about a Quercus species, an oak species, that you cannot seed bank. However, Encinitas baccharis is one species that you can seed bank, And so what you're looking at here is a bunch of packets that represent all of the productive maternal lines from the tiny type locality, which means that it's the population where this species was originally described as a species, and it barely exists any longer in Encinitas. So we did a really dramatic effort to make more of them. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but I wanted to highlight some of the plants that we have recently collected specifically to be put into seed banks for long-term conservation storage. And an important aspect of this type of work is, first and foremost, correct permissions and permits. Don't just go out and do this. If you're looking to be involved with this type of work, there are some wonderful organizations besides my own that do this type of work. And please work with us and don't just go out and start collecting seeds, because some of these populations are incredibly sensitive and we have to be very astutely aware of that. So I had the privilege a couple of years ago of helping to co-author the Center for Plant Conservation's protocols that relate to collecting seeds from wild rare plant populations. And that's exactly what you're seeing here. This is Helianthus niveus tephrodes. It's also known as the algodones sunflower, and it only grows in the dunes out near Glamis, kind of east along the 8, Imperial County, way out there in the desert. And this had never been collected and put into seed banks as a species. And it's a rare species. It's a 1B listed species. And so that's exactly what we did. We went out and I worked alongside colleagues from what is now the California Botanic Garden, previously Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden. So that's Duncan Bell in the left, a rare plant botanist from there. And we trekked through this essentially shin deep sand, about 25 miles in 2 days, collecting seeds. And importantly, what we do is to separate those seeds based on maternal lineage, so that what we're providing the seed banks and ultimately restoration ecologists and practitioners is the best and most controllable genetic representation of these, in some cases, very small populations. These plants tend to be really stingy with their seeds, but we got a good collection and they're in seed banks now. So hopefully these plants don't continue to get just obliterated by off-road activity, but I sadly cannot promise that. So if nothing else, we do have kind of a safeguard. Back to the Del Mar manzanita. This is just one of my favorites all the way through, in part because the garden itself has long had stands of this species in our public displays. On the bottom left there, you can see that the top of our North Mesa, where we have an overlook tower that looks out to the ocean. And if you look east instead, it looks over a beautiful natural space where we've had successive years of fledgling gnatcatchers, just a flourishing of some wonderful native plant species. And Del Mar manzanita is one of those. Believe it or not, this one was not represented in seed banks either. So I worked with the staff from the San Diego Zoo to collect seeds, not only from the Crest Canyon population in Del Mar, but also from our population at the Botanical Garden. At the same time, we accurately mapped it and reported that to California Fish and Wildlife so that it's properly reflected in the California Natural Diversity Database. And we vouched them, and I put these seeds through hell. We're doing a long-term germination study on that one, and it's pretty fun. So you'll see some more photos of that later. Encinitas Baccharis, one of the plants that we successfully accessioned into seed banks. This was 2 years ago now, actually, that we collected this. And we got it from 2 different populations, not only from the small population in Encinitas, but also one out in the Gibson Highlands. And this has become one of the plants that I legitimately have gotten obsessed with. Not only have we collected seed from multiple populations, at this point, I've tried to get eyes on every one of these plants that I can. And we even recently found just this weird disjunct population on a soil substrate that doesn't even make any sense on Otay Mountain. So there's so many unknown things about San Diego's native plants and what pollinates them and how their seed mechanics work, all kinds of things. So the opportunity for study is limitless. Here's one other opportunity, which is for me to point out Rachel Sadowski in the photo on the right. She actually, I hired her as a gardener back in the day, and she has come all the way through this growth process with me and is now San Diego Botanic Garden's conservation horticulturist. So she works with me closely, not only doing mapping and surveying and growing rare plants, but also in our restoration efforts, which I'll get to in a moment. But please, well, let me tell you about this because this is just one of our roaring successes. So we collected seeds from these 9 existing productive maternal lines in Encinitas, which means that there's only 9 female plants that we were able to find that actually produced seed. We only found about 25 individuals in the entirety of Encinitas, and these plants are dioecious, which means that any individual plant is either male or female. So you need at least 2 of them in order to have productive seed. We went up to Oakcrest Park where this grows, and it's this little postage stamp of a natural space in the middle of developed suburbia. And this is across the street from where this species was originally vouched and described as a distinct species. And it seemed a shame to me that we did not have this species. We used to in the garden back, if you go back to the 90s, but I had never seen it on site. And what a shame to have something that's so rare, essentially in our backyard, but that we weren't actively engaged with helping to preserve it. And so we changed that by collecting seeds, growing them out, and Encinitas went from about 25 of these plants to over 200 in 1 year. So that's not too shabby. We also put 14,000 seeds separated along maternal lines into 2 different seed banks, one of them the National Germplasm Repository in Fort Collins. And we distributed plants to more than half a dozen other botanical gardens throughout the state. So all of a sudden, this small population that's really on the verge of disappearing underneath encampments and trampling and unauthorized off-trail use is a little bit safer. We still want to engage the in-situ population. We want to preserve where they grow naturally, not just have them in a garden, but it's a start, it's a step. And the same is true with the Del Mar manzanita. We really hope to someday be in the business of doing active restoration with this species, but I need to figure out a bit more about how to do that in a way that we can ensure solid and robust and diverse genetic representation. So I'm less of a fan of cuttings than seeds. Go ahead.
Could you just go back to the slide that has the name on it? Somebody's asking it to get the name.
This one? Baccharis vanessae, is that the one?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, of course. It's a little known species, and it's just this inconspicuous green thing. So you'd walk past them 1,000 times without even recognizing that it was something special, but it's almost endemic to San Diego. And where it exists, it tends to be in very small numbers, even as small as like 10, 20 individuals in an occurrence. So with the Del Mar manzanita, I've been working with this one for a long time, and I have not cracked the code on this one, but I'm working on it. And so we actually collected more than 6,000 seeds of this a couple of years ago from several different maternal lines, and I'm working with them in a germination trial at this point, subjecting them to different pre-germination treatments, including fire and liquid smoke and being exposed to cold stratification to try to actually figure out what makes these things tick. And I think I'm getting closer, but I'm not quite there yet. So we're growing them, but I can't quite explain why we're having the success that we are. And I'd like to get to that point. I want to emphasize that a lot of this is done with incredible volunteer assistance. And if not for the solid professional team surrounding me, but also the really robust and dedicated volunteers who work with us every day, basically, we wouldn't be able to do this stuff. It's just too time intensive, it's too laborious, it's too detailed, and it's too expensive, frankly, for me to be paying everybody to do this work at this time. So I have to reach out to our volunteers and say thank you. This is just to show you some of what we're doing with the Del Mar manzanita seeds. And I want to reassure you all that in the frame where I'm lighting things on fire, Rachel was just off frame holding a hose, so we're trying to be safe as well as scientific. But I have to say that a job where I get to work with rare plants and I'm lighting things on fire at the same time, it's hard to beat. I really do love my job. And we're doing a lot more that's not just active growing of plants. The conservation horticulture is where my heart mostly lies, but we're doing a lot of pure research as well, genetic surveys. We're working with the Salk Institute to do a lot of genomic sequencing, and they have this wonderful project where they're trying to breed plants so that they can be used as a technology to essentially hyper sequester carbon in the soil. These are some other research projects that we're doing. Rachel on the left is collecting vouchers and tissue samples for an international genome collection initiative run through the Smithsonian, where they're actually trying to get at least half of all of the genera of all life forms on the planet represented in DNA repositories. Now let's get to the fun parts, the parts that I know that you all love, the plant propagation stuff. And this is Quercus dumosa, which we collected as an acorn on site. That's one of the plants that we're doing a lot of work with. I've got Ceanothus verrucosus on the left, which is also known as the warty stem Ceanothus. It's a really wonderful white flowering species that mostly grows along the coast. And the significant thing about that particular plant is that it was propagated by a high school intern who was working with me early last year. So I think it's really exciting to be able to work with the public in a way where we're teaching people skills that are important, but also just meaningful in terms of the significance that one individual that's produced represents. This is not just any rooted cutting. It's pretty wonderful for a 17-year-old kid to be able to have such a concrete positive impact on the world already. In the middle is Pherocactus gracilis. It's another species that we're doing some DNA studies with and collecting seeds because it's fun to grow. On the right-hand side is a plant that I think a lot of you will be familiar with, but not in this stage. So that's Dudleya edulis. That's actually an immediate after germination. And I put it under one of our scopes and took that photo where you can essentially see through the entire tissue of that thing. And they're specks, they're tiny, but Dudleyas are one of my favorites. We're trying to work with the plants that are on site that I want to see more of. Calochortus splendens and Calochortus weedii as well are good examples. And so we're working to collect seed from our populations and other populations that we have collecting permissions for. We're working with the city and the school district and the county and other entities, and then growing them. So I'm excited to plant these out and reinforce our existing natural population, although they are very slow. Botanical gardens are the perfect entity to be involved in a business that is just so painstaking and slow, but so wonderful. Please patronize me for a moment as I speed through some non-native plant stuff, because I want to give you a good sense of the type of work that we're doing, even if it doesn't relate to native plants specifically. So this is Brighamia insignis. It's a species that was native to Kauai. It was actually endemic to Kauai, and it used to grow on the cliff sides there before being destroyed by feral goats, wildfires, pollinator going extinct, and ultimately being essentially scoured off of the island by Hurricane Iniki. We happen to have some of this, and this is essentially like the California condor of plants. They only exist in captivity, and the pollinator doesn't exist any longer. So breeding is only in captivity and only at the hands of essentially skilled technicians. But I feel kind of weird saying that because I'm talking about myself with the paintbrush right here. So we're doing hand pollination of this. The ultimate goal is to get this species back into its natural habitat on Kauai, working with the National Tropical Botanic Garden. But that's not all there is to it. We're growing a lot of them. In some cases, that's the easy part. And making sure that this species has some form of sustainability beyond just a cultivated setting is really difficult, as was the case when essentially reintroducing California condors to the wild. So we're picking up a lot of techniques from the zoo. This is actually genetic analysis of all of the Brighamia insignis out there and put through a zoo software so that we're essentially making stud books for these rare species in the same way that zoos have worked with super endangered plants, yeah, super endangered animals like the white rhino, for instance, or Siberian tigers. And the point to this is that if we have to do the breeding, we want to know that we're doing it in a way that imparts the most genetic resilience to the species, rather than getting into bottlenecks of inbreeding and so on. We're also doing a lot of work in propagation of cycads. These are one of the most endangered groups of plants in the entire world, and they are heavily subject to poaching, unfortunately. So one of the things that we do to try to mitigate that threat to these natural populations, considering that I don't have the ability to have much influence in South Africa, for instance, or Mexico, but what we can do is try to get that market price down, propagate a lot of these plants, make them legitimately available so that people are less inclined to go out into habitat and steal and poach them. And as it relates to native plants, Dudleyas are a very good example of this. And I know that a lot of you will be familiar with Kevin Allison's work, which he's trying to do exactly that, just to make so many Dudleyas legitimately available that there would be no reason that anybody needs to go and essentially cut them off of the cliff sides, which is just such a tragic thing to witness.
Tony,
Go ahead, Kendra.
before you go on, somebody's asking about the white bags that were over the Calocortus plant.
Glendons.
Yeah, and yeah, what was the reason for them?
So think about it this way, those seed pods dehisce when they dry, they split and they'll drop the seeds. And I'm trying to cultivate those seeds because we haven't seen good enough natural recruitment of them. And the idea there was to capture them. It was the same story with the bags over the Brighamia fruits. Some fruits essentially open up and drop all their seeds out. And if you don't have a way to capture them, it doesn't work to just go and essentially pick them up off the ground. Ceanothus is a good example of something that actually throws its seeds. And so there's a lot of nuance to this. You have to know the individuals. And as some of you know, California has more than 6,500 different kinds of individuals. And our garden doesn't just work with California natives. So personally, I grow about 5,500 different kinds of plants. And you have to learn the unique quirks of all of them. And let me tell you something more about native plant work. And this is something that is near and dear to my heart. And I find it to be really an exciting new endeavor for the garden. We're actually in the middle now. We're halfway through the first ever restoration and habitat stewardship project that not only the San Diego Botanic Garden has engaged in, but that the city of Encinitas has led. So I want to really emphasize how wonderful it is that we're able to work hand in hand with the city that the garden sits in. And it's also my hometown, so it's particularly meaningful for me. This is an open space that's near where Highway 5 and Encinitas Boulevard cross. In between the highway and Vulcan Avenue, for those of you who know the area at all, this is an important historic drainage in Encinitas. This is the Cottonwood Creek watershed, which is essentially what led to the initial founding of Encinitas as a railway stop and as a town. And it immediately leads to Moonlight Beach, which is a very characteristic and important cultural place in Encinitas. So the fact that we get to have a hand in making it a better place in many different ways, so it's more enjoyable for recreation, to have more beautiful native plants in a space. It's safer to not have things like Ricinus communis, the castor bean, which is horribly toxic, just rampaging through our waterways. And we're making it a better ecological situation for birds, for lizards, for amphibians, and essentially for us as well. Let me just run through this photo array here. On the left, again, is Rachel, who is essentially my right-hand person in all of this work. And I really could not do any of this if it wasn't for the fact that she is so hardworking and technique oriented without losing sight of creative and kind of big thinking. We also have volunteers stacking our truck full of invasive species. We've pulled out more than 400 cubic yards of invasive species from this waterway in the past year, including really noxious things like Arundodonax, for instance, the giant reed, acacias, ice plant, as you can see, and you'll see more of that. This is our project site, and it's so wonderful to be able to be a contributor not only to the community that we're part of as a garden site, but getting outside of the garden. We're starting to have broader and broader influence in a good way. And it's something that I really cherish. And the fact that I get to be kind of the tip of the spear on this for the sake of this institution is incredibly honor. It's an incredible honor for me, but I want to make sure that you all know that this is the new way of being for this botanical garden. And we're going to be seeing more scientific and research staff coming on. We're going to see a huge uptick in our educational programs and offerings. And in the meantime, we'll be pulling ice plant. So me and some volunteers here, and we started out with this just horrible bank of almost solid ice plant. And then we strike all of that and start to put in native plants. So this is the fun part, as I see it, is getting to grow and install all of these native plants. Quercus dumosa on the left with me, and you can tell that I'm proud in that photo. I feel like a proud dad, essentially putting wonderful scrub oak back into habitat. In the middle, some of my favorite stuff that you don't always see commercially available. So Neoridium dumosum, which is also called bush rue. It's a beautiful, slow growing, it's almost like a natural bonsai species. And it's the only plant in the Rutaceae family, the citrus family in our area. Next to that one is Cercocarpus minutaflorus, which is mountain mahogany from our area. And one of my favorites, again, almost a natural bonsai, and you get the sense of why some of these places are called elfin forests. And I do want to emphasize that we are propagating this with huge help from volunteers as well as some interns. And these plants are all sourced, if not from our garden or the places that we're actually working in locally. So we're building out a network where we have access to wonderful plant material like this. And some of these plants were even given to us for this project by the Nature Collective. So it's really wonderful to have allies and to be part of such a cooperative culture. I love these glam shots, and I'll be happy to tell people more about which these plants are, but I need to tell you about this project because to me, it's the most exciting thing that we're doing right now. We're in the middle of a huge project related to Quercus cedrosensis. It's also known as the Cedros Island oak. And you might wonder why we're working with a species called Cedros Island oak, considering that we're not going down to Baja right now. Turns out that there's this weird little tiny disjunct population of this species immediately north of the border. And there's only a few hundred of them that have ever been observed, and the documentation for the species is really lacking. And on top of that, there has never been a plant cultivated and put into a living scientific collection like at a botanical garden from this species in the United States. It essentially does not exist outside of this tiny little relict habitat, which is under all kinds of new threats. And so we wanted to go out there and not only learn more about this and be able to document its existence before it hopefully doesn't disappear, but to actively make sure that that's the case, to bring propagules of the species out of habitat and grow conservation groves, assurance colonies, essentially, and distribute those to some of our partners so that, heaven forbid, something happens to these tiny little natural populations, that at least those species still exist somewhere, and that maybe like with the Brighamia, we can eventually work toward putting them back where they should be. This is just a beautiful species, but it barely exists in America. On the left here, you can see that that's what the map of this occurrence looked like previously. That's all that we knew, was that there was a dot right there, and presumably those trees are still there. So Rachel and I have been spending a lot of time out on Otay Mountain, and our map of this occurrence is on the right-hand side, and you can see that We've expanded the understanding of the natural range of the species in the United States significantly. But I also want to point out that all of those little orange marks are propagule collections that we have made. So we're working with this species not only in seed, but acorns cannot be seed banked. They don't tolerate freezing. So we have to grow these things. And so we're not only doing that from seed, hopefully, because we've been watching these trees for 4 years now without seeing a mature, viable acorn. They're really struggling to recover from successive wildfires that have hit ever since 2003, the Otay fire. But we're working with some wonderful partners, such as the San Diego Zoo's team, and we've actually brought this species into tissue culture cultivation for the first time. And it's a struggle. It's a resource intensive way to conserve rare genetics like this, but it is a piece of the puzzle. It's something, and we're trying to do all of the above. So we're out here. This is the habitat of this species. It's so rugged and so beautiful, and it's incredibly steep, and it's a little bit scary because we're right next to the border wall, and there's a lot of human presence. So me and Rachel getting out here in the thick of it. This is all Quercus cedrosensis. For the most part in our country, it's a very low growing shrubby oak. Beautiful, kind of mostly entire leaf margins, except it has this characteristic terminal point at the tip. And oak taxonomy is really difficult. So we are seeing some interesting hybrids out there. On the right-hand side is me standing underneath a Quercus agrifolia Quercus cedrosensis hybrid. So this is a coast live oak hybridized with the Cedros Island oak, and it has the same sort of style leaves as the Cedros Island oak, but it's a giant, and it's very interesting. And so given that we're seeing these types of hybrids out there, on the top left is me giving essentially a crash course in training the zoo's staff on how to look for hybrids and why we don't want to be working with them, presuming them to be straight species. I wish that I could get into this more, and we'll do a whole nother presentation about this project specifically, I'm sure, but this is me and Rachel and some of our colleagues from the zoo. This is just an expression of how wonderfully collaborative this type of conservation work is, because we all need each other. The plants need all of us, and we all need each other in order to get at any of the goals that we're collectively trying to affect. So this is us collecting those tissue samples, propagules for tissue culture. Another thing we're doing out here is to document. Go ahead, Kendra.
Could you just describe a little bit, if it can be short, how you can tell it's a hybrid, or is this like really complicated?
It's both. Some of them show leaf in the leaf really readily, and I have photos that would show that, but I didn't include them in this slideshow because I knew I was already going to be putting so many words out here. But the leaves look weird, and a lot of what I know of plants is by feel, which is not always the best way to convey something. And so it's been an interesting process for me in having to start to train people to understand and to see the same things that I am, without always fully knowing why it is that it's clear to me. So I can tell you that what we're seeing with the agrifolia hybrids, for instance, is that they are serrated on the margin. The leaves become a lot more oval shaped. They look a bit like Quercus agrifolia if it was shrunken and had a more pronounced apex with the spine. So Quercus cedrosensis, the Cedros Island oaks, the leaves almost look like a spade from a deck of playing cards. It's a little bit more rounded at the bottom, but it is obtuse like that. And then it has this really wonderful kind of narrowing, smooth margin, except for sometimes, and except for on the new growth. So is that clear, confusing? It should be both, because oak taxonomy is a nightmare. Wind pollinated trees are tough, I will tell you that. So what we do is to not presume to know anything. And if we're unsure and unconfident, then we're stating as much. and trying to do homework afterward. And that's part of why having access to some of the genetic study and tools of that type is changing the game for us in this kind of stuff. I wanted to include this photo because it's a little bit of a, it's unfortunate. That darker green stuff that you see, essentially where the arrow comes down, that is one of 3 occurrences on this mountain of this species. And there's only a couple hundred individuals maybe per occurrence. So there's less than 1,000 of these things in the whole country likely. And that's one of the populations or occurrences right there. And the reason that I'm highlighting this is not only because it shows you that the artificial border doesn't mean much ecologically, that this species exists on both sides. And to the oaks, an imaginary line like the border doesn't have any significance. But if you start making road cuts and you start building a wall, it's no longer an imaginary line. And in this frame, you can see that not only has there been 1 road cut through this population, but there's been 2. And the upper one has just all kinds of detrimental impact. It's actually, we're seeing slides out there, like rock slide that wouldn't have happened if not for the wall construction. This gets to be above my pay grade quickly in terms of influencing that kind of thing, but it is important that you, since so many of you in this audience are some of the main advocates and proponents of protecting these wonderful endangered native species, it's important for you to know that this is happening. It's important for you to know that this species exists in the United States and that it's under duress. Not only is it the wall and the roads, it's also fires, because we've seen 10 fires in this area in the past 12 years. And we're seeing a lot of unfortunate human impact. So we're collecting these rare species in the middle of a rugged wilderness that seems as though there should be nobody around and not likely to find things like trash. And instead we're finding just bushels of it. Shoes, clothes, food, water bottles. Unfortunately, the politics of the border is hitting this species hard. And since it exists as this tiny remnant, these occurrences in the United States were almost naturally being constrained and threatened. And then you exacerbate that with these types of things. And if we don't get this species essentially backed up and in a better state of protection, so we're trying to advocate for this species getting a sensitive listing through the Bureau of Land Management, since this is their land. If we don't make those kinds of moves, it's very easy for something like this to actually disappear without anybody like yourselves even knowing that it was there or what happened. So I don't want to be all doom and gloomy, because we are making good headway on this stuff, and we're part of a really wonderful big team. It's bigger and it's more diverse all the time. So let me just show you some of the other cool plants from this mountain. Otay Mountain is just this amazing botanical place. To me, it feels as though there's a piece of northern Baja that somehow was just transposed north of the border. And so we see very unique things like, on the left is Quercus acutidens, which is a hybrid species, and it contributes to some of the hybridization that we're seeing in the other oaks out here. But Arctostapylos otaiensis, the Otay Mountain manzanita, is just wonderful gray foliage with these soft pink sprays of those urn-shaped ericaceous flowers. And it almost only exists on this mountain. It's just an outstanding thing to see stands of this stuff. In the lower right is Ceanothus otaiensis. And initially, Rachel and I were looking at this thing. We're like, we can't quite figure out what this is. It's obviously Rhamnaceae, but it's got weird leaves. And it's almost succulent in its leaf, and it's tiny in stature. It's essentially a naturally dwarfed Ceanothus. And then it doesn't even have purple or white flowers like you tend to see in Ceanothus. They're almost pink. So it's a really beautiful place, and it feels otherworldly because there's so many weird plants out there. Leptocene meridema, for instance, the sea dahlia growing right out of the cracks in the rock. This is a weird coastal species that for some reason is out here nearer the desert. And I'm a huge Dudleya nerd, so I had to include a bunch of wonderful habitat shots of not only Dudleya edulis, but some ferocactus in there too. I'm a little bit wary about sharing specifics of the locations that we're seeing this kind of stuff, because sadly, this type of thing does get poached. So you should, as an informed consumer, you should really ask questions of nurseries. I would encourage that strongly, because they will want to tell you their stories if they're good stories. So upper right here, Salvia munsii, just a really beautiful species and smells kind of like grape soda. What's not to love? Salvias are one of my favorites because they just slam dunks in a garden setting. And I want to talk a bit more based on what Frank is also going to share with you all about how we can all be working together better to have a broader and more meaningful influence toward preserving and making native plant species flourish. So let me just leave this up here for a moment, because it gives you a sense of how diverse the network of partners that we're working with is. When it comes to that Quercus cedrosensis project, for instance, we have eight other gardens in California lined up to serve as backup colonies for this species whenever we can actually get it into cultivation. And I want to highlight that we're working with 2 federal agencies on this stuff. We're working with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which I forgot to put on here. And we've been at this now in partnership with the California Botanic Garden staff for 4 years, and I don't have acorns in hand. So one of the things that I need all of you to understand is that this is really important work, and it's ongoing in a really robust way, and for us in a way that is growing dramatically. But it's slow and it's hard, and it's something where, if not for just incredible persistence and lifelong dedication, as well as having the right types of support networks, it's easy for this stuff to go nowhere. And you are all as important of a part of plant conservation being successful as I am. If this is only up to botanists and horticulturists and ecologists and biologists, and we're going to go nowhere. If we can't get our broader society, our brothers and sisters, our neighbors, our friends, everybody that you know should have some understanding of what native plants mean and why they're important, and the fact that just because they're adapted to be here and they're proven in their resilience and tenacity doesn't mean that they are beyond need for significant help. And that's one of the things that we want to contribute to. We're not going to be in this alone, as you can see by this screen, and it shouldn't be done that way, and it can't be done that way, which means that I need your help. And there's a bunch of different ways that that can be. Obviously, if you want to give me money to do this kind of stuff at the garden, I'm not going to say no, but more realistically is time, energy, expertise. I know a lot of you are out there hiking trails. I want you to be sending me photos of what you're seeing. I want you to be connecting with stuff like iNaturalist. I want you to be buying native plants from reputable nurseries and just celebrating that in a way so that all of your friends want to be doing the same thing, rather than maybe some of these freaky aeroids that are going for like $1,500 unnecessarily. And help us, because this isn't us as in the botanical garden. This is us as in not even just California, but people globally. This is representative of how we do things right. And if we're not all part of it, we're probably not going to get it right.
Thank you, Tony. We do have a couple of questions that I just want to ask you. Cynthia is wondering about on Otay Mountain. Are you doing any studying of the lotus otayensis? She doesn't know if that's still the same name.
It's been changed to Hosakia rather than Acmaspon. So it's 2 names removed actually from lotus. But we are. One of the groups that we participate in is the California Plant Rescue, and it's this wonderful alliance of botanical gardens. And the goal of that group is to get most of all of the 1B species represented and backed up in seed banks or there's living collections with something like the Quercus. And so I'm actually writing a proposal right now. It's due early next month to do surveying, study, collection, grow out, all that kind of stuff, and actually produce horticultural production protocols for that species specifically. So that's one of the near-term goals.
Excellent. Also, somebody was saying, how can a species persist in the wild if its pollinator is extinct?
Well, it's variable. It's nuanced. This stuff is pretty not black and white. And so we're asking those questions too. And honestly, I don't have real specific answers for that one. I can tell you that with the Brighamia, which is probably what led to that question, that we're seeing some weird opportunistic pollination. So it's not, the flowers are not so distinctive morphologically that only one thing can pollinate them. It's just that only one thing historically was observed to be the thing that pollinated them. There's some orchids out there and some of these other flowers that if the right pollinator is not there, they don't produce seed. And that's how cycads exist in our area, because they're mostly pollinated by these little weevil-like beetles, and they don't exist here. And we're not looking to be importing weird random insects. So instead, I collect pollen and we work with our team and our volunteers, and we play pollinator. It does teach you a lot about the plant. If you can understand something well enough to, serve as a reproductive agent, it says something about understanding that species.
Excellent. And Christy was wondering, and an anonymous attendee was wondering about, way in the beginning, you talked about fire and putting smoke on the seeds. One question is the reason for the smoke experiment to see if the manzanita survives a fire? What's the reason for it?
I'm glad that's a good question. I kind of assumed a little bit of baseline understanding of manzanita ecology, I guess, because the presumption with a burl forming species of Arctostapylos like that one is that they come up from a fire from the burl, but then there's also these essentially species that come up from seed and from burls. So Ceanothus is a group that tends to come up from seed after fire. Arctostapylos is a group that does some of both, and even some of all of the above. And it makes it really hard to know what is going on in the field. Most of what we know about the species is from post-fire field observations, and there just hasn't been that much garden work done with it. So I've worked with those seeds enough to know that something related to smoke chemically, not smoke as in heat from a fire, but something chemically in the smoke, and something that relates to a combination of cold and moisture for a certain amount of time is a piece of this puzzle. So I can tell you that one of the treatments that we're doing is liquid smoke soaking, like you'd use in a barbecue marinade. So it's not fire, but it is a distillate from real smoke. And we're getting an uptick in germination from that treatment. I'm getting an uptick in germination from putting the seeds in the fridge for a couple of months. But if I do both of those, it's about 10 times as high as either of them, which are elevated from the control. And it's still really preliminary. I'm not publishing this data yet or any of that stuff, but I'm getting some clues. And I actually think that it may end up being that I need to acid scarify these seeds and then subject them to smoke chemicals and then put them through a false winter essentially in order to get them to go. So there's a lot to it. And that's one species.
When Christy says she has some manzanita seeds, so you think like a combination at home, you need a combination of all of these things in order to germinate them?
If you want to take a shotgun approach, what you can do would be to put the seeds in the oven at maybe like 200 degrees for an hour or so. You get kind of the heat scarification element there. Put them into about a 2% smoke mix, distilled water to liquid smoke concentrate, and then put them in your fridge with a moist paper towel and count 2 months and pull them out. And then sow them in a fast draining mineral mix, like coarse sand primarily. And then you're probably going to have to wait 18 months. I have some seeds coming up right now that I sowed in October of 2019. So it's a waiting game, but that's the only way to get these unique genetic entities of these rare species.
Wow. Okay. Well, sounds a little complicated, but very good. And then one last question. This is from Jeremy, and he's wondering what your favorite native plant is.
That's a hard question. So let me spin it a little bit in my favor. I'll tell you that the first native plant that I ever grew, like Kendra mentioned, I got into all of this through food. I grew food. Actually, pardon me. Okay, we have a new eco-sensitive building, and it just shut everything down on me because I hadn't been moving enough. But Dudleya pulverulenta, the chalk Dudleya, a lot of you are probably familiar with that. It was the first native plant species that I ever bothered to grow. And that was at a time before I had actually decided to bother to grow anything that wasn't food. So that was my first non-food native plant species, all in one.
Great. And then one final question coming from David is, are there any nurseries carrying these plants that you've, these rare and endangered ones that you've propagated and grown?
Well, one of the things that's difficult about some of this work is that legal protections in some cases actually work a little bit both ways. So if I'm working with something as rare as the Del Mar manzanita, for instance, that's a federally listed endangered species, and I just can't sell them. We can get into the world of doing some horticultural production, and botanical gardens are the entities to be doing this because we have such a robust tracking system of our plants, but it's complicated. And right now we are not offering that type of plant material, but we are growing a lot of native stuff specifically for sale. So I have hundreds of sea dahlias. We have just a world of chaparral yucca. We're doing a ton of things like artemisia, buckwheat, sages, a lot of fun things, and some unique kind of spin-offs of it, but if nothing else, you're getting a piece of our garden. So there are some good nurseries out there working with this type of plant material, but I'll tell you that botanical gardens tend to be the only place that you're likely to get some of this stuff other than the CNPS sales. Those are actually the best place to get unusual native plants that I've seen.
Okay, thank you very much. That's fascinating, Tony. Thank you so much for teaching us all of this. And now we have a presentation by Frank Landis. There you are, Frank. Hi,
Yay!
Frank.
And my mic's working too. Good. Okay, let's see. I want to share screen. And I want to welcome everybody who's still awake to second half of this presentation. This is going to be short, and I don't know if sweet's quite the right word, but sort of the opposite of what Tony just gave you, which had all the beautiful pictures and not that many words. This is going to be a lot of words because I'm going to talk fairly fast because I only have 10 minutes. And they will show up, by the way, in the newsletter in a different form. So don't worry about it if you can't write or you're not recording this. Anyway, Joseph wanted me to talk a little bit about conservation of rare plant committees and CNPS-SD because I'm the chair of both at the moment. But I decided to take this in sort of a different direction. So I'm actually going to, instead of trying to recruit you guys all to my committees, I'm going to talk about what you can do as just an ordinary citizen that'll help conservation efforts. So it's why the little things matter. That plant, by the way, if it helps you for scale, that's my wedding ring, and that's a Phacelia stellaris, otherwise known as Brand's Phacelia at Silverstrand. So we get some small plants around here. Anyway, let's see if this is going to work. There we go. Okay, we actually do have a native plant problem, although it's not obvious that it's a problem. We have around 1,700 native plant species, most of any U.S. county. Most of these stats come from either John Rebman or the CNPS for a plant atlas. Anyway, about 290 of the species of those 1,700 are in some way sensitive, so which means they're listed by I'll just run through that once, California Rare Plant Ranking. Anyway, over 200 of those 290 are on our list 1B or 2B, meaning that they could be or are listed as threatened or endangered in California. And of those 200, 16 are actually listed as rare, threatened, or endangered by the California or the U.S. Endangered Species Acts. Now, the other thing is it's not just the number of species, it's the size of the area we're in. Because San Diego County at 1,700 species has more native species than the state of Hawaii, or either of the Dakotas, or even the state of Alaska. However, area-wise, at 4,207 square miles of land, San Diego County is not quite 200 square miles bigger than the Big Island of Hawaii. So, and finally, we've got the little problem of people, which is the Big Island is home to about 185,000 people. San Diego is the 5th most populous county in the nation, and it's got 3,338,000 people roughly, and that's about 18 times more people in the Big Island. So the problem we've got is that I'll go back. The problem we've got is basically we've got a lot of people in a small area with a lot of native plants. And so what that means is, and a lot of rare plants. And so what that means is there's a lot of pressures. Now, if we look at an even smaller area, San Diego City has got the same problem. This is just the parks in the city of San Diego, not the entire city. And the parks alone have over 700 native plant species, which is comparable roughly to the Everglades. Around 93 of those species are sensitive or listed. And city parks get more visitors than Yosemite. And of course, our entrance fees are far lower, which means we can't really afford the same staffing that they get in Yosemite. So basically, every big park you go to, and some of the smaller ones, has the sensitive plants in it. So of course, Mission Trails and Penasquitos do, Black Mountain does. Did you know there's some at Dog Beach? Possibly not. How about Fiesta Island? Some of you know about that one. Some of you don't. There's actually 2 out there. 3. Anyway, so we're the most biodiverse county in the U.S., and of course, we're the 5th most populous county in the U.S. And we've got more rare species in a smaller space than most states, not counties, states have to deal with. And if we're not diligent, we could easily become the extinction capital of the U.S. rather than America's finest city. Now, the other problem I didn't put up here is that most of the people in San Diego moved here as children or adults. So we don't have this deep history of people that know that this is a biodiverse place. We have people move, like our supervisor, Nathan Fletcher, who moved here from Arkansas. So they grew up running in the woods, and they grew up camping, and they grew up cutting down trees. And that's perfectly reasonable if you're in a place like Arkansas. It's not so reasonable if you're in a place like Penasquitos. And unfortunately, people transfer the culture without realizing that San Diego is a very different place than most other parts of the US. So what can you do to help if you're not a native plant expert, or even if you are? The following suggestions really aren't in any particular order, so I'm not doing one of those late night talk show things exactly. One is obviously you can learn your local plants. That Phacelia stellaris was growing next to a public picnic table at Silverstrand on the Bayside. Now, the thing is, the parks already figured out that, oh, there's rare plants around the picnic tables, we should get rid of the picnic tables. But as soon as they did that, the Phacelias that were growing around them disappeared as the site got overgrown, because the Phacelia depends on disturbed sand in the summer, and it grows in the winter. So as long as people are using those picnic tables during the summer, they keep it open and the Phacelia is there. If they don't, if they stop using the tables, the area gets overgrown and the Phacelias go away. So that's one thing. This is the kind of weird stuff you get in San Diego just as a matter of course. And so you can't, as Tony said, you can't just learn one plant but it helps to learn the ones you interact with regularly, which is your local plants, whether they're local to your home or local to your favorite park. Rare plants are definitely not limited to the mountains or desert. They occur some of them occur. Phacelia stellaris actually grows out of the pavement at Silverstrand, and Ambrosia pumila grows out of the pavement in National City. They're all over the place. Anyway, some of the plants need a little disturbance like the Phacelia, but most really need to be left alone. And the best way to deal with this is not to set them aside as some sort of museum diorama, but to treat them as part of your community and give them the space they need. So if you have plants that need to be not trampled on, don't trample on them. It's really simple. And also support, plants don't live in a vacuum, so also help support their pollinators, their seed dispersers, and the other part of their support network. This is where your backyard gardening, especially if you're near a wildlife area, can really help if you're keeping the pollinators around when nothing else is blooming. So it's important stuff. And obviously you can protect your native plants by doing things like not stepping on them, not sitting on them, not picking them, or not hacking them down because they're slowing your bicycle run. You can also keep your dogs and small children out of vernal pools, even though you splashed in mud puddles when you were a kid. Don't create play areas for your children in open space preserves. Don't practice your survival skills at open space reserve, and respect fences and signs. By the way, this is stuff I saw in Del Mar Mesa and Penasquitos Canyon in the last 6 months. So this is stuff that's going on right now. And again, this is really simple stuff, but one of the reasons we have so many rare plants not doing well is people do all of these above and more. And I am keeping that list short because I've got probably about 5 minutes left, 4 minutes. Another thing you could do, as Tony suggested, is educate your friends, random passersby, people you meet on the trail who are standing off the trail, all that stuff. So you may not know your native plants, that's fine. How about teaching people park etiquette? For instance, you could educate people about poison oak, rattlesnakes, ticks, and the virtues of staying on the trail. You'd be amazed how much toilet paper we've seen in poison oak patches, and you know the rest of the story, and you wish you could have told them to stay on the trail there. Educate people about not leaving a trace. Educate people that the whole children in nature movement shouldn't be about building play forts and ecological reserves, which unfortunately they do. It is fun to learn to leave no trace, and it's fun to teach children to be similarly observant and compassionate, and of course, very, very sneaky. My mom taught me. So you can educate people about San Diego's native plant problem. I think most people don't realize just how much pressure the plants are under. And also help everybody understand that, as Tony said very eloquently, that it's a problem that all of us have to help on. We all need to take care and do the simple stuff. Anyway, big 3 threats to native plants are in order of threat of harm they cause are habitat loss, invasive species, and climate change. So I'm going to give you some ideas about how to deal with these. One thing to realize is once a plant is conserved in a park, it is not safe. There's vandals, there's flower collectors, there's trail builders. There's also politicians and planners who think that a park is a perfect blank space on the map for a new commuter bike path or a playground or some other amenity. I've been dealing with that a lot in the last 6 months. Each of these problems demands different strategies, but the critical point is, and this is something I hope you remember, conserved has to mean conserved. Conserved cannot mean set aside for later use. So if you can take away nothing else, remember conserved means conserved. It's set aside in perpetuity. It's not set aside until someone else has a bright idea. So anything you could do to protect habitat, and that's from showing up at meetings if you're that kind of person, or talking a mental child, shall we say, of any age, out of building an illegal trail, that's a step in the right direction. Conserved has to mean conserved. It's not just a place that was set aside so some idiot could build a trail there. Invasive species. Weeding as restoration is something our chapter is extremely good at. However, we do not recommend weeding around rare plants. That's something you have to know what you're doing about. However, keeping weeds from taking over fields that happen to have rare plants in them somewhere else and get it is something you can do, because the weeds usually come in invasion waves starting at the edge of the park. And if you don't like weeding, one of the best things you can do is keep your shoes free of weed seeds and keep your bike free of stuff, and don't track the stuff into the park. And if you have a knack for weeding, join the restoration committee and get involved. We always need more people doing weeding. And then, of course, there's climate change. It's currently number 3 on the list of threats to rare plants. It'll most likely be number 1 in a few decades. Hopefully, we'll radically change our lifestyle. I'm not counting on it. There's a huge amount of inertia built up in civilization. But I think the point to realize is that civilization is at risk from climate change too. So this isn't just we lose the rare plants, too bad, what good were they for anyway? We're all in the same boat. It's not a rare species problem. It's everything's problem. That's what mass extinction means. So please, I know it's hard, work harder on decarbonizing, and hopefully we'll make a big change. And finally, the thing that everybody doesn't think about, because we focus on rare plants, there's 1,500 odd plants out there, some of which are extremely odd, and we don't want them becoming rare at all. Rare is just basically a rare species is in the emergency ward. And so you don't want more species showing up at the emergency ward. You want to give them the equivalent of public health, and you want to keep the common species common. So this is something that most people don't realize is how fast common species can become rare. But I went to school back east, and I learned the story of the American chestnut, which went from a forest dominant species to functionally extinct in the wild in less than a century because of a fungus. So we could quite easily lose the coast live oaks to all these beetles that are kicking around, and there's other plants that are similarly a threat. So don't just protect the rarities, protect native plants in general, and hopefully they'll keep the common ones common too. So anyway, as Tony said, there's a lot for everybody to do, so please help. And by the way, just to show Tony, this is about a 15-foot tall Nuttall scrub oak in the tunnels at Del Mar Mesa. And somebody kept banging their head on it, so he thought this was the appropriate response to cut the branch off and then paint it. So.
Yeah, that's a pretty obvious lack of respect. But that's a beautiful place. That's actually one of the most outstanding stands of that species anywhere.
Yeah, I go in there every week to take care of it because I did my master's on scrub oaks. So, but yeah. So anyway, oops, I'm echoing. Any questions, or did I just make everybody's eyes glaze?
No, I think everybody's probably just a little shell-shocked right now. That's some hard information to swallow.
By the way, this is what we deal with on my committees. So if you want to join the committee and help, this is what we do.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Frank. That was real quick and dirty, real dirty. But thanks for your work. And Tony, thank you so much for your work. I think if we all can work together in this, maybe we can get some real wheels turning, and there's hope for native plants out there. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and thank you everybody for watching today. Remember, if you missed anything, it's all going to be recorded and put onto our website and our Facebook page. And hope everybody has a good evening.
Yes, thank you. It's a great presentation. And thank you, Kendra, for moderating. And thank you, Joseph, for keeping it running.